There is a phrase that for generations made Roman mothers shudder and Roman senators lower their voices. Hannibal ante portas. Hannibal is at the gates. Not the name of a distant threat, not the echo of a long-forgotten enemy, but the visceral fear of a man who was real, who breathed, who bled, and who almost brought the greatest republic in the ancient world to its knees. Who was Hannibal Barca? A Carthaginian general born in 247 BC on the shores of North Africa, in a city that Rome had just humiliated. A man who, at the age of 9, placed his hand upon the blood of a sacrificed animal before the altar of Baal, and swore an oath that would shape the destiny of the entire Mediterranean world. He would cross the Alps in winter with 40,000 men and war elephants, a feat that military historians still regard as one of the most audacious maneuvers in all of human history. He would defeat Rome in battle after battle, year after year. He would massacre between 50,000 and 70,000 Roman soldiers in a single afternoon on a flat plain called Cannae on the 2nd of August, 216 BC, one of the deadliest days of combat the ancient world had ever witnessed. And yet, despite all of this, despite 15 years spent marching through the heart of Italy, undefeated in every pitched battle he chose to fight, Hannibal would never take Rome. He would never see his city of Carthage triumph. He would die alone in exile, swallowing poison from a ring he had carried for years, rather than submit to Roman chains. This is the story of a man who won every battle, but lost the war. A story of genius and tragedy, of oaths and obsession, of an empire that feared one man above all others and never stopped fearing him, even in death. This is Hannibal Barca. Carthage, 237 BC. The city rises from the North African coast like a jewel of the ancient world. Its harbor is a masterpiece of engineering, a double port, one for merchant vessels loaded with silver and tin and grain, the other a hidden military harbor, capable of concealing 120 warships behind its curved walls. The streets are wide and busy, lined with workshops and warehouses, the air thick with the smell of salt, cedar wood, and dye from the purple textile workshops that made Carthage famous across the known world. But beneath this wealth lies a wound that has not healed. Just 4 years earlier, in 241 BC, Carthage had surrendered to Rome at the end of the First Punic War, a 23-year conflict that had bled both powers dry. Rome had forced Carthage to cede the island of Sicily and pay a crushing war indemnity. The city's pride was shattered, its treasury was empty, and its army, the army that had fought with such ferocity and skill, had been left without a war to win. Into this world of humiliation and ambition, a 9-year-old boy walks beside his father through the stone corridors of a sacred precinct. His father is Hamilcar Barca, the general they called the Thunderbolt, the man who had held Sicily with guerrilla warfare long after the war was lost at sea, the man who alone among Carthaginian commanders had never been defeated in battle. Hamilcar Barca, whose very surname means lightning in the Semitic tongue, had been recalled to Carthage only to find a city seething with resentment and longing for revenge. Now Hamilcar was preparing to sail for Iberia, modern-day Spain, to carve a new empire for Carthage from the silver-rich mountains and fertile plains of the peninsula. And his eldest son, Hannibal, had begged to go with him. According to the historian Polybius, Hamilcar agreed. But first, he brought the boy to an altar where a sacrificial animal had been prepared as an offering to Baal Hamon, the great god of Carthage. He placed his son's hand upon the blood of the sacrifice and demanded that the boy swear, not a child's promise, but a sacred oath before the gods, an oath never to be a friend of Rome. What passed through that boy's mind at that moment, we cannot know. What we know is that Hannibal never broke that oath. He carried it for the rest of his life, like a brand upon his soul. The years that followed turned Hannibal into a soldier. He grew up in military camps in Iberia, marching in the dust beside professional warriors from across the Mediterranean, Numidian horsemen from the deserts of Africa, fierce Iberian swordsmen from the mountains of Spain, Gallic tribesmen with their terrifying battle cries. He learned strategy not from books, but from watching his father outmaneuver enemy tribes with speed and cunning. He learned that an army is not a machine, but a living creature, that loyalty must be earned, not ordered, and that the terrain of the battlefield can be as deadly as any weapon. When Hamilcar drowned crossing a flooded river in 228 BC, Hannibal was 18 years old. Command passed to his brother-in-law, Hasdrubal the Fair, and Hannibal served under him as an officer, gaining experience and the fierce devotion of the men around him. One Roman historian, Livy, would later write of the young Hannibal that the old soldiers who had served under his father saw him again in this young man, the same fire in his eyes, the same look of absolute determination.
When Hasdrubal was assassinated in 221 BC, stabbed by the slave of a Celtic chieftain he had personally offended, there was not a moment of doubt about his successor. The army proclaimed Hannibal, 26 years old, as its commander-in-chief. The Carthaginian government confirmed the appointment almost immediately. Rome, watching from across the Mediterranean, took notice. It was that same year that the Roman Senate made a quiet diplomatic move that would, within 2 years, ignite the most devastating war the ancient world had seen. Rome extended its protection to the city of Saguntum, a prosperous Iberian trading city located south of the Ebro River, well within Carthage's sphere of influence. It was an act of provocation, deliberate or clumsy, that Hannibal would not ignore. In 219 BC, Hannibal laid siege to Saguntum. The city resisted for 8 months with extraordinary courage. Rome sent protests, then envoys, then ultimatums, but no army. Saguntum fell. Hannibal sent the spoils back to Carthage, ensuring the government's support. Rome then sent a delegation to Carthage, demanding that Hannibal be handed over for punishment. Carthage refused, and so, officially, the Second Punic War began. Rome's strategy was straightforward: send one army to Spain to confront Hannibal, send another to North Africa to attack Carthage directly, end the war before it began. The plan was reasonable. What Rome had not counted on was that Hannibal had no intention of waiting to be confronted. Hannibal was going to Rome, and he was going to get there in a way no one had ever imagined. In the spring of 218 BC, Hannibal assembled his army at Cartagena, his base on the Spanish coast. Historians debate the exact numbers, but the force was enormous, somewhere between 40,000 and 60,000 infantry, several thousand cavalry, and 37 war elephants, those great gray beasts of battle that could shatter cavalry formations and terrorize infantry simply by their presence. He marched them north through Spain, crossed the Pyrenees into Gaul, fought his way through hostile Celtic tribes, and reached the Rhone River. And then came the Alps. It was late October, already autumn, when Hannibal's column began its ascent. The passes were narrow, the rocks treacherous with ice and fresh snow. Mountain tribes attacked from the cliffs above, hurling boulders down on the marching column. The cold was savage. Men and animals died of hypothermia, of falls into ravines, of exhaustion. The elephants, those extraordinary creatures that had been ferried across the Rhone on great rafts of earth and wood,
struggled through the snow with bewildered panic. When Hannibal finally descended into the Po Valley of northern Italy, 15 days after beginning the crossing, his army had been reduced dramatically. Perhaps 20,000 infantry remained and around 6,000 cavalry. He had lost, depending on the source, between a third and half of the force he had started with. Most of the elephants would die within weeks from the cold and unfamiliar terrain. By any rational measure, the campaign should have been over before it began, and yet, those 26,000 soldiers that remained were the most experienced, most battle-hardened veterans in the ancient world. They were lean and angry and utterly devoted to the man who had led them through the impossible, and their general stood before them, one eye lost to an infection contracted in the Italian marshes, and told them what came next. Rome lay to the south, and Hannibal was going to make Rome tremble.
The Romans had not been idle. When news reached them that Hannibal had crossed into Italy, the consul Publius Cornelius Scipio, the elder, father of the man who would later become Rome's greatest hero, raced north with his army. He had expected to fight Hannibal in Spain. Instead, he found himself facing a Carthaginian force already descending from the mountains into the rich agricultural plains of the Po Valley. The first real encounter came at the Trebia River in December of 218 BC. Scipio's co-consul, Tiberius Sempronius Longus, was eager for battle, impatient for glory, and deeply underestimating the man across the water. Hannibal knew this. He sent his Numidian cavalry across the river before dawn to harass the Roman camp, and when the furious Romans waded across the freezing river to give battle, they found themselves cold, wet, and hungry, facing an enemy that had eaten hot breakfasts and warmed themselves by fires. Hannibal had hidden 2,000 soldiers in the undergrowth along the riverbank, and at the perfect moment, they struck the Roman flanks. Between 15 and 20,000 Romans died in the cold water and along the frozen banks. Rome absorbed the shock. It always did. New consuls were elected, new legions raised. But then, in the spring of 217 BC, came Lake Trasimene. Hannibal had marched south through the Apennines with terrifying speed, appearing in central Italy when Rome had expected him still to be in the north. The consul Gaius Flaminius pursued him with an army of perhaps 30,000 men, burning with the desire to drive the invader from Italian soil. Hannibal chose his ground with the precision of a surgeon. He positioned his army on the hills above a narrow road that wound along the northern shore of Lake Trasimene in the early morning fog that hung heavy over the still water. When the Roman column marched into that corridor, with the lake on one side and the hills on the other, they walked into an ambush so perfectly constructed that it has been studied in military academies for over 2,000 years. Hannibal's forces attacked simultaneously from all directions, in the fog, before the Romans could even form battle lines. Consul Flaminius was killed in the first minutes of fighting. Within 3 hours, between 15 and 25,000 Romans were dead. Many drowned in the lake as they tried to flee. Another 1,500 were captured. It had not been a battle, it had been an execution. Rome was in terror. The city appointed a dictator, Quintus Fabius Maximus, who took a deeply unpopular but strategically sound decision. No more pitched battles. Shadow Hannibal. Burn the earth. Cut his supply lines. Deny him the decisive engagement he needed. It was a strategy that might have worked, but Romans, above all things, wanted to fight. They called Fabius the delayer, and not as a compliment. By 216 BC, Rome had had enough. The dictator's term expired, and 2 new consuls were elected with a clear mandate: destroy Hannibal. Rome assembled the largest army it had ever put in the field: 80,000 infantry, 6,000 cavalry, 8 full legions. Their orders were unambiguous: find Hannibal, crush him. Hannibal, meanwhile, had seized the Roman supply depot at Cannae in the flat agricultural plains of southern Italy.
placing himself between the Roman army and its food supply. He chose a battlefield that suited his cavalry perfectly, open, flat, with a dry summer wind called the libeccio blowing dust into the faces of any army approaching from the north. He positioned his 40,000 infantry and 10,000 cavalry, and he waited. The Romans came on August the 2nd, 216 BC, in the full blazing heat of the Apulian summer. They outnumbered Hannibal's forces nearly 2-to-1 in infantry. Their strategy was brutal and simple. Pack the heavy infantry so tight that nothing could stop their advance, punch through Hannibal's center, and roll up his flanks. Numbers would decide the day. Sheer Roman weight would prevail. What happened next is still studied today by military commanders around the world. Hannibal had deployed his Gallic and Spanish infantry in the center, in a formation that bulged forward toward the Romans. On the flanks, he placed his elite African veterans, disciplined, heavily armored, waiting. His superior cavalry held the wings. As the Roman mass advanced and pushed forward, Hannibal's center deliberately gave ground, bending, retreating, drawing the Romans deeper and deeper into what appeared to be a breakthrough. But it was a trap. As the Romans pressed forward, packing tighter and tighter in their excitement, Hannibal's African veterans on both flanks wheeled inward and attacked the Roman sides. His cavalry, having already broken the Roman horsemen on the wings, now swept around behind the Roman formation and struck from the rear. The Romans were completely encircled. 80,000 men surrounded on all sides, so packed together they could barely swing their weapons. The slaughter lasted until nightfall. Ancient sources give numbers that are almost impossible to comprehend. Between 50,000 and 70,000 Romans killed in a single afternoon on a single field. Among the dead were the consul Lucius Aemilius Paulus, 29 military tribunes, 80 senators, and what historians estimate was 1/5 of all adult Roman men of fighting age. The surviving consul escaped with a handful of soldiers. The Carthaginian losses? Approximately 6,000 men. When the news reached Rome, the city fell silent before it erupted in panic. Women flooded the temples, weeping for sons and husbands. The Senate met in emergency session. Rumors spread that Hannibal's cavalry was already riding toward the city. One of Hannibal's commanders, Maharbal, the brilliant Numidian cavalry general, reportedly urged his leader, "March on Rome now. I will ensure that within 5 days you will dine in the capital." Hannibal did not march on Rome. It is the decision that historians have debated for 2,000 years. Did he lack siege equipment? Was his army too exhausted? Did he hope that Rome's Italian allies would now defect to him, making the city fall like ripe fruit? Maharbal, according to Livy, replied to his general's hesitation with words that have echoed through the centuries. "You know how to win a victory, Hannibal. You do not know how to use one." Hannibal remained in southern Italy, and Rome, battered, bleeding, seemingly broken, refused to surrender. The Senate rejected Hannibal's offer to ransom the Roman prisoners. They lowered the conscription age, they armed slaves and offered them freedom in exchange for service. They appointed new commanders and raised new armies. The great Roman machine, grinding and terrible, simply rebuilt itself. For the next 13 years, Hannibal marched through Italy, winning battles, besieging cities, forming alliances with Capua and Tarentum and Philip V of Macedon. He was undefeated in every open battle he chose to fight, and yet the decisive victory that would force Rome to negotiate never came. Carthage, distracted by its own political struggles, sent insufficient reinforcements. His brother Hasdrubal attempted to march an army from Spain to join him in Italy and was intercepted and killed at the Battle of the Metaurus in 207 BC. The Romans cut off Hasdrubal's head and threw it into Hannibal's camp. Hannibal looked at his brother's severed head, and for the first time, those who watched him said they saw something different in his eyes, something that had not been there before. He was still in Italy, He was still undefeated, but the war, the real war, was being lost somewhere else. We have watched Hannibal build his legend in blood and brilliance, the crossing of the Alps, the rivers of Roman dead at Trebia, Trasimene, and Cannae, the years of marching through a land that feared his very name. Now we ask you, at this moment, knowing what you know, do you believe Hannibal could still have won? Was Rome's survival a miracle, or was the flaw always in the strategy? Leave your answer in the comments. The story is not over. While Hannibal marched through the south of Italy, undefeated, isolated, and increasingly desperate for reinforcements, a young Roman commander was quietly rewriting the rules of the war. His name was Publius Cornelius Scipio. He had been present at the Trebia in 218 BC and at Cannae in 216 BC. He had watched Hannibal destroy Roman armies with the same patient precision a craftsman uses to disassemble a clock. And instead of turning away in horror, Scipio had studied every detail. He had understood, perhaps better than any Roman before him, that Hannibal could not be beaten by brute force or by Roman pride. He had to be beaten by someone willing to think the way Hannibal thought. In 210 BC, Scipio took command of the Roman forces in Spain. In 4 extraordinary years, he drove the Carthaginians out of the entire peninsula, not just by winning battles, but by doing so with Hannibal's own techniques: rapid movement, coordinated cavalry, the flanking maneuvers that had made Cannae a masterpiece. By 205 BC, Spain was Roman. Scipio returned to Rome and was elected consul at the age of 31, a decade younger than the legal minimum, a testament to how desperately Rome needed him. Scipio had a plan so bold that many in the Roman Senate thought it madness. Do not chase Hannibal around Italy. Attack Carthage directly. Bring the war to Africa. Threaten the enemy's home city and force Hannibal to abandon Italy and come back to defend it. In 204 BC, Scipio landed in North Africa with an army of 26,000 men, many of them survivors of Cannae, fighting now for redemption. He won battle after battle against Carthaginian and Numidian forces. Within a year, Carthage was in genuine danger, and in 203 BC, the order went out from the Carthaginian Senate that Hannibal had dreaded and known was coming: return to Africa. For the first time in 15 years, Hannibal left Italy. He had arrived in 218 BC with an army of veterans. He left with 12,000 of the survivors, men who had followed him across the Alps and through a decade and a half of war. As his ships pulled away from the Italian shore, it is said that he wept, not from weakness, but because he knew, with the cold clarity of a great commander reading a battlefield, that the ground had shifted beneath him forever. He landed at Leptis Minor on the Tunisian coast and immediately began rebuilding an army from whatever was available: his veteran survivors, new Carthaginian conscripts with little experience, 80 war elephants that were barely trained. He had roughly 36,000 men. Scipio, reinforced by the Numidian cavalry of the chieftain Massinissa, Hannibal's former ally now fighting for Rome, had comparable numbers but far superior cavalry. Before the battle, according to both Polybius and Livy, the two generals met in person. Two of the greatest military commanders in the history of the ancient world, face to face on the North African plain. Ancient historians record that Hannibal spoke first, proposing a negotiated peace. He acknowledged Rome's strength, spoke with the authority of a man who had seen more war than any living Roman, and argued that what remained to be won was not worth the lives it would cost. Scipio, polite but unmoved, replied that the time for negotiation was before Carthage had broken the truce. Now, Carthage would face the consequences.
The Battle of Zama was fought in October of 202 BC.
on the sun-baked plains southwest of Carthage. Hannibal opened the battle with his elephants, a charge that in earlier years had broken cavalry formations and spread terror through enemy ranks. But Scipio had prepared for them. He arranged his maniples in wide corridors so that the elephants charged down empty lanes through the Roman formation, guided by noise and torchlight, unable to find soldiers to trample. The Numidian cavalry then fell upon Hannibal's cavalry on both flanks and drove them from the field. Hannibal's infantry fought with extraordinary discipline, pushing back against the Romans in 3 successive lines. But when Scipio's cavalry, having routed Hannibal's horsemen, swept back around and struck the Carthaginian rear, the same move that Hannibal himself had used at Cannae, turned now against its creator. The battle ended as a contest and became a rout. Some 20,000 Carthaginians were killed. Another 20,000 were captured. Roman losses numbered around 1,500. Hannibal, for the first time in his life, had been decisively defeated in the field. Carthage capitulated. The peace terms were devastating. All overseas territories surrendered. The fleet reduced to 10 warships, a war indemnity of 10,000 silver talents to be paid over 50 years, and Carthage forbidden from waging war outside Africa without Roman permission. Hannibal stood in the Carthaginian Senate and urged his city to accept the terms. Acceptance was the only road to survival. In the years that followed, Hannibal turned to politics. Elected chief magistrate of Carthage in 196 BC, he threw himself into reforming the city's finances with the same intensity he had once applied to warfare. He streamlined the administration, rooted out corruption, and paid down the Roman indemnity ahead of schedule, refusing to raise taxes to do so. Under his management, Carthage began to recover with remarkable speed, and Rome watched and grew afraid. Roman envoys arrived in Carthage with accusations that Hannibal was secretly corresponding with Antiochus III, the Seleucid king, plotting a new war against Rome. The charges may have been largely fabricated, but for Hannibal, who had spent his life reading the intentions of enemies on distant battlefields, the message was clear. Rome was preparing to demand his surrender. He would not wait for it. In 195 BC, Hannibal slipped out of Carthage in the night and sailed east into exile, never to return to the city he had served and saved. He made his way to the court of King Antiochus III of the Seleucid Empire, offering his military expertise in the king's conflict with Rome. The Romans defeated Antiochus at the Battle of Magnesia in 190 BC, and as part of the peace terms, demanded that Hannibal be handed over. Warned by a sympathetic courtier, Hannibal fled again, to Crete, then to Bithynia, in what is today northwestern Turkey, where King Prusias gave him refuge.
Even there, he could not rest. It is said that during a naval conflict between Bithynia and the Kingdom of Pergamum, Hannibal devised a uniquely disturbing tactic. He had clay pots filled with venomous snakes catapulted onto the decks of enemy ships, sending the enemy crews into screaming chaos. The old genius had not forgotten how to win. But Rome never forgot him. In 183 BC, Roman agents arrived in Bithynia, and Prusias, no longer willing to risk Roman anger for the sake of one old general, agreed to surrender him. When Hannibal's servants came to him and told him that the house was surrounded, that there was no way out, Hannibal reached into his ring. He had carried the poison for years, perhaps since the day he left Carthage. Some ancient sources suggest it came from his father, carried from the wars of his childhood in a ring he never removed. It was, in its way, a final act of absolute command, the last decision that no Roman could take from him. Ancient historians record his final words. The Roman historian Livy transmits them as follows: He reportedly said that he would relieve the Romans of the anxiety they had so long endured, since they thought it too much trouble to wait for an old man's death. He swallowed the poison. He was approximately 64 years old. It is a remarkable and melancholy footnote to history that Hannibal and Scipio Africanus, the two greatest commanders of their age, the men who had faced each other at Zama, died in the same year. Scipio, too, spent his final years in exile, driven from Rome by political enemies who could not forgive a man of too much greatness. Both men died far from the cities they had served in the same year, 183 BC. The ancient world's two greatest generals outliving their time, consumed by the very powers they had made dominant. Hannibal was buried in Bithynia at a place called Libisa, which modern historians identify with the town of Gebze in present-day Turkey. His grave was forgotten. No monument was built. Rome exhaled. And yet, Hannibal refused to remain buried in history's silence. His tactics were studied obsessively by Roman commanders in the generations that followed. Julius Caesar would read of Cannae and model his own encirclement strategies on its principles. Centuries later, Count Alfred von Schlieffen, the German military strategist whose plan shaped the opening of the First World War, would declare that Cannae remained the ideal to which all military commanders should aspire. Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in World War II, would state that every ground commander seeks the battle of annihilation, and that the classic example, still, was Cannae.
Napoleon Bonaparte studied Hannibal's campaigns with admiration that bordered on reverence. The U.S. Marine Corps still includes Cannae in its curriculum today. 2,200 years after that August afternoon on the Apulian Plain, the world's most powerful military institutions still teach what Hannibal Barca understood in 216 BC. Was Hannibal the greatest general who ever lived? Many have argued that he was. Polybius, the Greek historian who interviewed men who had fought in the war, placed him among the foremost commanders of antiquity. The Roman commanders who faced him, even those who eventually defeated him, acknowledged his genius with a mixture of awe and barely concealed terror. And yet the question lingers, the one that Maharbo posed at the gates of history's greatest might have been. Why did he not march on Rome after Cannae? Could he have taken the city? If he had, what world would have emerged from the rubble? A world in which Carthage, not Rome, became the dominant civilization of the Mediterranean, of Europe, of the centuries that followed? We cannot know. We can only trace the ghost of a man walking through the olive groves of Bithynia, his ring on his finger, carrying the poison he would one day use. A man who had crossed the Alps in winter, who had felt the earth shake beneath his elephants, who had watched 50,000 Romans fall in a single afternoon and understood that even that was not enough. A man who had sworn at the age of 9 before the altar of his gods that he would never be a friend of Rome, and who, in the end, kept that oath completely. Hannibal Barca, the man who made Rome afraid. The man Rome could never quite forget. To everyone who has stayed with this story from the Alps to Bithynia, from the altar in Peniscola to the plains of Cannae and Zama, a profound and genuine thank you. Your presence here, your curiosity about the ancient world and its extraordinary figures is what makes this journey worthwhile. The story of Hannibal is, in the end, not just the story of a general or a war. It is the story of what one human being can accomplish against all probability, and what history does with greatness when it cannot contain it. If this moved you, challenged you, or made you see something old in a new light, the best is still to come. Stay close. The ancient world has more to tell us.